Hey everyone, it's John Heath here again for MiltonRose Learning with another Let's Learn lesson on the turning points of World War I, so 1917 to 18. So we're going to be looking at the real hinge points in this conflict and what kind of drove it towards its conclusion. So we're going to look, as we normally do, on the context and the causes of these turning points, what was driving them to happen in the first place. Then we will move to a really good chronology of the turning points, which will help beef up your notes in class. And then we'll have a little look at a turning point of a turning point, which is a bit weird, but I will explain all. And then we will finish by looking at the historical significance of these turning points for the end of World War I, but also the broader political constellations after that. So first off then, let's look at the context and the causes. What was actually, as the war grinds on into 1917 and 18, what was driving these key turning points? Well, first off, the Russians were struggling. So we have the Russian collapse and Bolshevik Revolution. So on the Eastern Front, there was massive military casualties suffered by the Imperial Russia, economic collapse and severe food shortages, which combined to really shatter brittle Russian civilian and troop morale, ultimately causing the abdication of Tsar Nicholas II. As you can see for visual, there's a bit of a video there of the revolution kind of starting to take place. And then an avatar of Nicholas II who has to abdicate. So it's all going downhill for the Russians. And once the Tsar is safely out of the way, we have the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk in March 1918. So basically Lenin's Bolsheviks and communists, they needed peace in Russia to rebuild the country. So they seized power and they signed a very harsh peace treaty with the Germans, which officially removed Russia from the war. Okay, so that was a key kind of element behind the turning point of taking Russia out of the war. Then another kind of key piece of context here, we have German troop transfer to the West. So there was an Eastern victory dividend, as we may say. Once the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk was signed, as you can see in the image there, then the Germans could move a lot of their troops. So exiting the war freed up nearly 500,000, 500,000 veteran German soldiers from the Eastern Front, which was like Christmas for the Germans, because now they could move all of those troops onto the Western Front. It created a race against time, though, because the German High Command knew that they had a very narrow window to win the war before American forces arrived in large numbers, because, as we know, by this time, the Americans were incensed over unrestricted submarine warfare of the Germans and eventually pulled them into the war. And they were trickling forces over the Atlantic, so Germany kind of had a very quick window where move the troops from Russia and try and use that to knock out the French and the British on the Western Front. Then, in terms of context for these turning points again, as I kind of alluded to there, American entry into the war. So 1917, so unrestricted U-boat warfare was basically really irritating the Americans and President Woodrow Wilson there in the image. So their attacks on neutral shipping directly targeted American vessels crossing the Atlantic, which drove the Americans nuts, obviously. And it culminates in the US declaration of war. So President Woodrow Wilson declares war in April 1917, and that injects massive, almost unlimited industrial resources, financial credit, and, crucially, fresh manpower into the conflict, which is going to make it very difficult now for the Triple Alliance to actually win. So those are the kind of key contextual points which were driving these turning points and touching on some of the turning points themselves. Now let's have a nice look at a really good chronology and then what I think is one of the key turning points amongst all of them. So first off, we have this charming guy. He looks quite stern there, but that is, for anyone who's on the history, Vladimir Lenin. so the leader of the Russian Bolshevik Revolution. So in March to November 1917, Russian revolutions and the US entry. So let's tease those apart a little bit more than we have so far. So the Tsar is overthrown in March, so mass strikes forced Tsar Nicholas to abdicate, to leave the throne basically, and a provisional government kept Russia in the war to begin with under Alexander Kerensky. So it kept Russia in the war, but that doesn't last for very long, which we'll talk about in a minute. US declared war in April 1917, so America entered the war following what was called the Zimmermann telegram, which you can research. It's basically a telegram from Imperial Germany to Mexico saying, well, you're next door to America, why don't you invade them? So the Americans were never really going to take that lying down. So they, declared war on Imperial Germany. And then the Bolshevik Revolution occurred in November. So Lenin's communists get rid of the provisional government and seize power, promising bread, peace and land. Okay, so that's a massive slide there. There's a lot going on there. Then, to follow this through in terms of turning points, we have the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk. So basically it's extremely harsh peace. So Russia officially surrendered to Germany, ceding 34% of its population and 54% of its industrial land, because most of the good industrial land in this period in Russia was in the west. So they lose a lot, basically. Eastern divisions then are freed for Germany, as you can see in the image there. Nearly 500,000 veteran troops, and they transfer directly to the Western Front. Okay, as quickly as they can be sent over, they start moving over to the west. And it creates a strategic kind of closing window. Germany gains a very temporary numerical advantage on the Western Front before the Americans can arrive. So what are they going to do? I think you probably know. They're going to culminate. In military theory, it will be called a culminating point. They will force all those troops through as narrow a gap as they can on the Western Front to try and puncture the British and the French lines. Okay, then, as we say, what happens then? Well, what do? They launch Operation Michael, basically a spring offensive on the 21st of March 1918. This is Germany's last roll of the dice. So a massive assault. General Ludendorff in the image, looking very austere, launched a 6,000 gun bombardment along what were the old kind of Somme battlegrounds or battlefields. He also uses stormtroopers, who were very dangerous, specially trained elite soldiers. Infiltration units, they used to bypass Allied strongpoints, so don't get bogged down, just go past them. And the stormtroopers helped to break 4 years of trench stalemate, and they actually advanced 40 miles, which was massive in this period. So Operation Michael was actually quite effective, at least initially, and it brought a Parisian threat. So long-range German artillery could actually begin shelling Paris, so they're getting closer, a bit too close than we would like, and it sparked widespread civilian evacuations from Paris. So it was a big deal, Operation Michael. However, thankfully, June-July 1918, the German advance from Operation Michael stalled. So overextended lines. The German forces outran their supply lines, and they couldn't get the food and logistics and bullets to the men quick enough, leaving stormtroopers exhausted and starving as well. The US Marines by this time start to kind of get involved with the US kind of army. American forces halted the German advance at Belleau Wood and Chateau Thierry. So they start to kind of slow down, and remember, the American troops were totally fresh. They hadn't been in combat, so they didn't have all the kind of headaches that our soldiers did. And the Second Battle of the Marne, Allied counterattacks halted the final German offensive, permanently shifting the strategic initiative now to the Allies once and for all. Okay, so that provides you with some nice kind of notes now to beef up your historical events on the turning points. But within this, what do I think? I know we're talking about turning points here, so it's a bit strange talking about a turning point there. But I think the most important one for me is the US entry into the war, I think in April 1917, because it brings inexhaustible resources. It guarantees the Allies unlimited financial credit, like a blank cheque, industrial capacity, and also fresh manpower who have not been damaged by 4 years of horrendous trench warfare, or 3 years at the time. And that created kind of German despair. It shattered German strategic hope, and it forced Ludendorff into an all or nothing attack. It was basically get this done before the Americans arrive, or it's over. And you can see the kind of look on the Germans' faces here as they go into Operation Michael. You know, it must have been horrendous to go over the top. It's a do or die attack. Punch through the British and French lines here, otherwise the war is over. So it creates this kind of countdown clock in the German High Command's strategic culture. So that is the historical events of these turning points. Now, to round off, what was the significance then of these turning points? Why are they important to the war and to general history? Well, in terms of tertiary significance, the ones that aren't quite as significant, but they're still important, but not quite as important as everything else. It was the birth of the USSR. So the Bolshevik Revolution established the world's first communist state, and that shaped, obviously, 20th century global politics, obviously the later Second World War and then the Cold War. And it redrew Eastern Europe really. So the Russian collapse opened the door for new independent nations in the in Eastern Europe. So Poland, Finland, the Baltic states, new states come into being and assert their independence. So it redraws Eastern Europe's political or geopolitics, I should say. Then in terms of secondary significance, what's important? Well, it's the breakdown of trench deadlock here. So tactical innovations, the German Stormtrooper infiltration tactics, which are very fascinating actually to study. It shattered 4 years of Western Front trench stalemate during the Spring Offensive. The Stormtroopers used very interesting revolutionary tactics, and they would sneak through, infiltrate. I'm not saying they were like ninjas effectively, but they were very highly trained. They had very good weaponry, and they would be very quiet. And if they came upon an enemy strong point, they wouldn't engage it. They'd just slip past it and then just go on to the next line. So it made them very, very dangerous in terms of breaking the trench deadlock. But also the final German gamble lost. So the failure of the Spring Offensive, or Operation Michael as it was known, eliminated Germany's last operational reserves and morale. They had nothing left. After that roll of the dice, there's no other dice to roll. So it was like strategic bankruptcy now for Germany. And they realised they couldn't win the war now, and that's what Ludendorff said in a quite famous conference. But in terms of primary significance, what do I think is the most important? And you can kind of debate these because that's what history is all about, debating. But in terms of primary significance, I would say this. I think it brought the shift in the global balance of power. US-American reinforcements injected unlimited industrial capability, financial credit, as we've said, and roughly 10,000 fresh troops daily into the Allied effort. Germany will not be able to face that for much longer. Okay, and the Russian exit as well, as we know, the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk removes Russia from the war, absolutely pivotal, which then temporarily frees German troops for that single front kind of campaign in Operation Michael. And you can see the Germans here, for any visual learners, just being ferried across very quickly to the Western Front. It kind of created that strategic mania in the German High Command to get them over to the Western Front as quickly as possible, and we have to end the war very, very quickly. So it kind of forced their hand, and they kind of made that fatal strategic error at the end of the war. Okay, so those for me are most of the key turning points of this war in 1917 and 18, which really brought it to a kind of victorious conclusion for the Allies. hopefully that's kind of really kick-started your revision on this part of the war as well. Don't forget to hit the like, subscribe and tap the bell icon so you never miss another Let's Learn video again. If you have any kind of nice comments or anything that you want to kind of talk about in terms of the turning points and the content for this video, please do just pop them in the comments and we'll pick them up on YouTube and reply to them as best we can. And it just remains to say, really, hopefully you've had some fun there. It's been very interesting tracing the turning points. So keep an eye open for the final kind of episode in the World War I series.